Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Chung. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Level Access. I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us today from across industries, roles, and regions. It's absolutely incredible to see such a passionate community gathering today to talk about the future of accessibility.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Duto. My pronouns are she, her. I lead our program in strategic services here at Level Access. I help our organizations take their digital accessibility initiatives from, hey, we should do something about accessibility and grow them into sustainable and scalable programs. I also lead our digital accessibility maturity model assessments, which is our Level Access framework that helps define what great programs look like and how organizations can get there. I've been in the field for over 15 years, and most of that time is in program leadership in the trenches, starting a program from scratch in the ed tech space at a university. And I have some scars to prove it.
Thanks, Jackie. I'm Corb O'Connor. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I serve as Level's Director of Thought Leadership. I've led digital teams for the last 15 years as well, building B2B and B2C websites, apps, and even at-home COVID test kits. I focus on equipping organizations to build scalable approaches to digital accessibility that don't require, hundreds of dozens of accessibility specialists at the organization. So with our customers, I focus on co-creating processes, reporting structures, and business cases that move those customers to a proactive approach to legal compliance and improved connection with disabled users.
Today, we're diving into the state of digital accessibility for 2026. This isn't just another industry update, it's a look at what's really holding teams back, and more importantly, how we can move forward together. Accessibility today, it's now a boardroom conversation, at scale, proven by the fact that 90% of the respondents are at organizations of over 1,000 employees. Additionally, the challenges and the solutions we'll discuss today are relevant everywhere. Digital experiences are built since our audience spans both private and public sectors, with 74% from businesses and 25% from government and education. So get ready for new data, honest stories, actionable insights that you can take back to your teams. Quick housekeeping, everyone's muted on entry, so we can keep things clear. Need captions? Turn on real time closed captioning in your settings. Live chat is closed, but do drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll answer that during or after the session. And don't worry, your entire recording will be shared once it's ready and captioned. So let's dive in. So accessibility is really, holding steady while other equity initiatives lose momentum. So this isn't just resilience, it's actually recognition. Organizations increasingly see accessibility as a business discipline, not a compliance checkbox, which is amazing. The slight year-over-year increase in maturity markers suggests that many teams are maintaining the infrastructure they built. But the plateau in proactive adoption tells us that awareness isn't translating into action. And so we're here today to talk about what's stalling progress and how to restart it. Thank you, Corbin, Jackie. So just a quick cover here. Here's what we're going to cover today. So first, a quick introduction to Level Access. Who are we? Why did we do this State of Digital Accessibility report? Then we'll dive into key insights, like why legal risk feels high, how AI is changing accessibility, but not always fixing workflows, and why proving value remains a challenge. We'll also talk about how to reignite momentum as proactive efforts plateau. And finally, we'll wrap up with key takeaways for 2026 and leave time for your questions. All right, so let's get started. So let's talk about the State of Digital Accessibility report. So let's start with who performed this survey, and it's yours truly, Level Access. So Level Access, we've been at the forefront of digital accessibility for over 25 years. So we're not just a vendor, we're a trusted partner to 5 of the Fortune 10 companies and more than 30 of the Fortune 100, and across industries like retail, healthcare, financial services, education, and technology. And we work with more than 30 of the Fortune 30. With a team of more than 500 employees, a global footprint in more than 25 countries, we bring deep regulatory expertise, like the two individuals that you see here today, Corv and Jackie, to the market, right? We're not just keeping up with the industry, we're helping to shape it as key contributors to the upcoming WCAG 3.0 standards. We're actively influencing the future of digital accessibility worldwide. And our long-standing leadership, combined with our commitment to innovation, makes us the most experienced and forward-thinking accessibility partner in the market. Whether you're just starting your accessibility journey or scaling enterprise-wide, Level Access is here to help guide you every step of the way. Cord, can you tell us a bit more about the report, actually?
Yeah, where all this data came from, and perhaps it's from many of you. And if so, thank you for contributing to this important research. So the State of Digital Accessibility Report, or SODAR as we call it, is our annual survey developed in partnership with the International Association of Accessibility Professionals and the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, or G3ICT. We've been conducting this research since 2019. 6 years ago, as the champion leader of US Bank's accessibility initiatives, I distinctly remember being an attendee on this very webinar as Level Access walked through its initial results. So this year, over 1,600 professionals representing a wide swath of sectors, industries, disciplines, and markets from the US, the UK, and EU shared how their organizations approach accessibility, what challenges they face, and where priorities are shifting. We intentionally expanded this year's outreach to include respondents from Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands, along with additional perspectives from the US public sector. So our goal is that this brings richer insight into the challenges and opportunities facing both public and private organizations around the world.
So who are our survey respondents? Just a quick snapshot. 74% reported that they work at private sector organizations and 25% in the public sector. 90% work at organizations with over 1,000 employees. 81% of our respondents are in senior management or above, and 42% are in that top level management. 53% are based in the US and 45% based in the UK or in Europe. So with that cross section of respondents, right, across industries and different size organizations, we feel pretty confident that this is a good representation, that this data is a true reflection of what accessibility looks like in current practices and programs today. What are the most pressing challenges? And we feel confident talking about the insights about what's on everybody's mind and where accessibility is headed next. Now let's get to the fun part that we've all been waiting for.
All right, let's dive into some of that SODAR data and what we learned from our respondents. What they shared about some of their current challenges, as well as some trends and insights that we can learn from them to take action. So let's talk about trends and risk. Corv.
Yeah, let's talk at first here about 2 data points. 92% of respondents say they're at least somewhat confident in the accessibility of their primary digital experience, their primary website, their primary app. 59% feel at risk of legal or regulatory action in the year ahead, and that's up from 41% last year. So hopefully those 2 statistics have you scratching your head, right? Confidence in digital experiences is high, but so is perceived legal risk. So this disconnect suggests that teams may not fully understand their exposure. And this is what we call the risk gap. And that risk gap intensifies with intensifying global regulations. So we've been advising our customers about what's been unfolding in Europe over the last several months as the European Accessibility Act comes into force. So in July, 2 groups, APIDV, a French nonprofit that advocates for blind and visually impaired individuals, and Droit Pluriel, an association that works to make justice accessible for people with disabilities, they both issued formal notices to 4 of France's largest grocers, arguing that the website's discriminating against blind and otherwise disabled shoppers. So after filing that in July, they met with the grocers and then realized that there wasn't going to be real progress. And so in November, these groups summoned the retailers back to court. Sure, one retailer said their site was 12% more accessible over the last few months. It satisfied half of France's RGAA requirements. Think of that as the WCAG requirements, a little bit extra in France. However, the groups are asking a judge now to force these companies to comply or shut down their websites, which these advocates say blind people just can't use. The websites lack alternative text, they have insufficient color contrast, they have vague links and interactive elements that can't be used with a keyboard, and a flawed content structure, think headings and regions. So there's one example. These retailers saw a jump in their accessibility and thought, well, 50% is better than 38%. But meaningful access lags behind, thus opening them up to that legal risk. They're very confident, but there's still this legal risk. So this perceived risk from tightening global regulations is high. In the US, 4 in 5 public organizations believe they're at risk of being caught for non-compliance. A little more than a year and a half ago, new regulations under the Americans with Disabilities Act were released, giving organizations, 2 or 3 years to become compliant. And many of these state and local government entities have not made progress. So now, and remembering that the European Accessibility Act applies to anyone doing business in Europe, regardless of where that particular company is based, in our survey, 3/4 of respondents said the law applies to their businesses. However, only a little more than a third, 37%, report being compliant. So this shows that the risk isn't coming from a lack of awareness. Organizations know these requirements apply. The gap comes from a lack of process. So half of our respondents say they don't have sufficient systems to meet compliance requirements efficiently. Just under half, 46%, point to insufficient resources, and about 4 in 10 to a lack of even understanding compliance requirements. So many in our survey, roughly 4 in 10, said that legal action is unavoidable, either because there's just so many lawsuits or regulatory actions, or their brand is just usually in the crosshairs. So it's easy to see why accessibility work plateaus as organizations believe that they'll be targets no matter what they do. So Jackie, you and your team work with our customers one-on-one to develop these strategies. Tell us about what you're seeing in these programs.
Yeah, thanks, Corb. We see these process and sort of risk management challenges with our customers' programs. And this trend has continued to show up in our SODAR data year after year. Earlier this year, I saw this play out as we were working with a financial company. They're international. They're scrambling to comply with that European Accessibility Act. They had started conducting their accessibility testing on their main sites. They were starting even to work on remediating some of those issues. So they were feeling confident that they had this solid start, right? And as we were diving in further, we quickly realized, right, it wasn't enough for them, right? They sort of had this aha moment, like, we don't have a process. How do we even demonstrate compliance, right? How do we document it? They didn't have any standard process for tracking that remediation progress. Everything was sort of scattered and siloed. So they couldn't easily show what had been fixed, what was still left, right? Who owned it. They didn't have like a sound system of record. So even, once they fixed all their issues, right? Nice work, great job, good start, right? They still had this lack of documented process, and a lot of that uncertainty, that's what left them at risk. What can we learn from this data point, right? What can we take away from it? How can organizations address this gap, improve that risk management? I'll just say the organizations that I see doing this well, that are tackling this, there's 3 sort of buckets or main ways that I see this happening: centralization, automation, and ownership. So with this particular financial company, we've been working on centralization, right? How do we get all of their test results, all of these remediation efforts, and monitoring data, all of this into one place, right? Onto a unified, centralized platform, because that's when we can start to make sense of all of it, right? If everyone's working off the same data in the same place, it's so much easier to see what are our most critical issues, what are our biggest risks. We have a clear picture of progress and priorities. So second is finding where we can automate, right? It's a lot of data we're trying to make sense of. To make this easier, we've been working on using automation from within this centralized platform to analyze all of it and help us make sense of common issues. Can we find common issues across all these different assets to help us prioritize, right? It's so much easier now to see what those issues are, to rank them. What are the ones most critical? What are the riskiest? What are widespread across the assets? What have the biggest business impact? What are the ones that we can fix to get some quick wins? And so it's just so much easier to just have that bird's eye view and make decisions from that data. And then the fun part is we get to document our progress. It's so much easier then to see how we're making progress, track our remediation in real time. They're generating reports, right? Without that manual effort, combing through all those different spreadsheets, duplicated issues. We're just making it's so much easier to really sort of prove our progress and demonstrate that compliance. And then that third piece I talk about is ownership. This particular team, they're working on, identifying who should own what pieces. Now that they've centralized their data, we have clear priorities. It's so much easier to understand the work being done and who owns it, right? With clear responsibilities, accountability, they can maintain oversight and sustain that progress, right? So in short, it's centralize for clarity, automate for efficiency, and then assign ownership for that sustainability. Andrew, do you want to talk about what we learned about automation and accessibility?
Yes, love this topic. Thank you, Jackie. Love that
Mhm.
story. Love that customer story. And thank you, Core, for that data. Yeah, so, AI, it's now table stakes, is what we're finding in digital accessibility programs. The question isn't really about, if teams are using AI, it's whether the fixes are actually moving with the work. And so in this year's SODAR data, 82% of respondents said they're incorporating AI into their accessibility strategies. It's up from last year, and it's really signaling, real momentum, and but that momentum stalls actually before it reaches day-to-day design and developer workflows. Only 20% report using designer tools and 31% report using developer tools for accessibility. So AI is present, but it's not just not embedded where decisions and code actually change, right? And we sort of see this divergence of the data presenting itself. And so that gap, really matters. If accessibility intelligence sits outside tools like design tools, IDEs, CI/CD systems or content systems, we're effectively forcing teams to context switch. And that's really what the data is telling us. And so the result is really around slower fixes, inconsistent outcomes, and a higher bar to reach in order to achieve your accessibility goals, which might be risk related, procurement related, efficiency related. And so, what closes the gap? Well, what closes the gap and what we're recommending is making accessibility a part of the flow, embedding checks in the tools that people already use, backing them with role specific guidance, and shifting from reactive audits to proactive practices when you're ready. And that's really about the heart of accessibility in your DNA. The other piece here is that time is the currency that teams just don't have, right? 32% answered that they put insufficient time to address issues as their top three challenges, second only to competing priorities. And competing priorities have been at the top of the list for some time as well. And there's really like two drivers in what we're seeing with our customers and with customers that I talk to is like two drivers. One is late stage work, right? Fixing issues after launch. That's really expensive and can be slow. And as well, detached guidance, teams hunting for the right tool or the snippet instead of getting it at the moment of design or at commit. And so the report shows a perceived legal risk remains high, which compounds the urgency to want to remediate fast and quickly. And the fastest path to time back isn't more after the fact, testing, right? It's moving accessibility earlier into the tools. When checks and practical guidance live inside design systems, authoring tools, developer pipelines, teams are really able to prevent issues before they exist, and they spend less time fixing. So Jackie, going back to you, what's been your experience with customers? Do you see this with our customers, with clients?
Yes, Andrew, this one really resonates. And I would imagine many of you on this call right now could probably relate to this as well. I've worked with probably hundreds of different programs, and I can't think of a single one that has said that we have too much time. Working with a team right now, an engineering team of with a small SaaS company. It's a great group of engineers. They're on board with accessibility, but they just sort of have bluntly said, Jackie, we care, this is important to us, but we just don't have enough time, right? We're dealing with so many late stage accessibility tickets issues. They're piling up. As you mentioned, Andrew, right? If those checks are happening after the code is written, it's just piling up the work, right? And so for them, this is resulting in this sort of reactive, reworking features, right? Going back and forth, it's context switching. And you add in the stress of, potentially delayed releases. So of course there's this frustration. It's almost this deflated feeling, right? With the team, almost just the slowdown with all this rework. And there's just this feeling that there's never enough time to do accessibility well. What can we do about that? Right? If there's not enough time for accessibility, I wish I could add hours to the day, but I can't. But let me just share a few common strategies that I see orgs who are doing this well, trying to solve this. I break it down into three main strategies: embed, train, and proactively shift. So for this particular SaaS company that I'm working with, this engineering team, we're working with their leader right now to embed accessibility checks and guidance in the developer tools, right? To Andrew's point, where that work is already happening instead of after the fact. We're asking questions. Can we put in quality gates during development? We're talking about, can we start to check during design? What pieces can we start looking at during design? This isn't going to happen overnight, right? So we're taking it in phases, but we're starting to address accessibility in their process earlier and along the way. They're already starting to see that pile of tech debt shrink a little bit as we're starting to make this shift. And I would say more importantly is there's a boost in morale, right? That we're not adding to this pile as we're continuing on. The second piece is training. Organizations that are doing this well, they make accessibility a part of their DNA. They have people with the right knowledge and the skills to do it well. We all know for training to be effective, it's got to be practical. It's got to be role specific, right? It can't be just sort of checking that box, right? We've all had that compliance training, and if it isn't relevant to what I'm doing, it isn't going to be as effective, right? We can't just tell everybody to take a bunch of courses. It's got to be valuable. It's got to be available when you need it. It's got to be relevant to the actual work that they're doing. And then finally, this sort of proactively shifting, right? It's an intentional shift from reactive to proactive practices, like this team that we're working with, right? So instead of scrambling to fix issues after it's launched, we're looking at how to repurpose. If you think of repurposing that same time, working down that pile, if we can start shifting that into that planning and the design and working through issues as we're developing. So using tools and processes to catch those problems early before they become expensive and time consuming and that we have to rework them. The orgs that are doing this well, they understand that shift actually saves them time. It saves them money. And it can accelerate actually timelines and delivery. It can actually become an advantage, this competitive advantage, right? Checking for accessibility during design and putting in those quality gates during development. To summarize, we are putting accessibility into the flow of the work. We want to equip everybody with the knowledge and skills that they need to do it well. And we want to start early. And that's how we can stop treating accessibility as just that checkbox and really make it a competitive advantage.
While new AI-powered tooling may be an integral opportunity for closing process gaps, technology alone won't drive programs' effectiveness. Executive support and education, as Jackie mentioned, both play key roles in the success of our accessibility efforts. If there's one thing that we accessibility professionals have been saying for decades, it's that accessibility drives real business value. And so when we finish today, I want to assure you that you're saying something that isn't just a habit, it's fact. Professionals recognize that investing in accessibility pays off, delivering competitive advantage and improving performance in key areas like customer satisfaction and revenue. 89% of respondents say digital accessibility is a competitive advantage. 75% say digital accessibility helps improve revenue. And 90% say digital accessibility helps improve customer satisfaction. So before you, like me, say, yeah, of course, I encourage you to take the time to check that we and you and your organization are showcasing these themes every time you meet with executives. We know it, but do they know it? And can we show it? Every day, I hear from teams who struggle to prove the value of accessibility to executives. 31% of professionals say a lack of alignment on the value of accessibility is a top challenge. Our findings underscore that executive support is critical to digital accessibility program success. Respondents who say executives in their organizations are highly supportive of digital accessibility are more likely than those with moderate or no executive support to connect digital accessibility to improvements across a wide range of business outcomes, like improved user experience, improved customer acquisition, and increased revenue. So our team in London heard from one of our customers just the other day that immediately after fixing one color contrast error, they saw the click rate on that call to action button in their app jump by 27%. One color contrast error, 27% success rate. That's how you align the value of digital accessibility. So when executives support accessibility, they tell the story because they're watching the metrics. So conversely, when we track and share those metrics, executives pay closer attention. So aside from risk, what is that value in your organization? Is it conversion, adoption, usage, experience, revenue? So without clear reporting, teams can't sustain that level of support. This is what we call the evidence gap. Jackie, I wonder, would you share a recent example of where you saw that gap almost kill an entire accessibility program success?
Thanks, Corb. I get this asked this all the time. Jackie, how do I make the business case? How do I prove ROI? I was working with an accessibility team at an ed tech company on this very issue. This team, they had started making real progress on accessibility for their flagship product. They were fixing issues. They had trained folks, right? It was just sort of this small but mighty team, but they were struggling to translate that to their leadership. And they said, frankly, our leaders don't quite understand accessibility, let alone the value of it. And they had wins, right? But they were sort of buried. They had some in spreadsheets and they had like some raw numbers, but they hadn't done the work of really sort of translating that into outcomes and impact. So of course their leaders couldn't make sense of it. They couldn't really understand the return on investment, the story around accessibility very well, right? And then when it was time for leaders to make decisions, what's a good investment? Their accessibility budget was potentially put on the chopping block, right? That champion, that team needed that clear, compelling evidence, or they were going to lose their budget and their momentum without it. So what are some ways that you can get everyone aligned on the value of accessibility? Champions and programs that are trying to address this evidence gap, I'll say in sort of three ways I'll talk about here. There's leadership ready reporting. To Corb's point, accessibility is tied to business goals. And it's regular communication, right? So for the first one, leadership ready reporting for this particular ed tech company, we started creating some executive summary reports to show that evidence of their progress, clearly demonstrating the impact, fewer errors, better user experiences that reduce legal risks that Corbett talked about. And they've been using analytics tools to streamline this reporting, right? So that it can be quick when they're asked for it, right? They can generate that data they need to tell the story. And why is this critical, right? Because only 30% of organizations are using reporting tools today, and a third struggle to align on that value, right? This is this point. So having that reporting ready to go for leaders. The second one is really tying the evidence to the business outcomes, right? So for this particular ed tech company, we were helping them demonstrate how accessibility is actually helping them win more contracts, right? With their universities, state and local governments who are concerned about Title II of the ADA, right? Showing that their product was more accessible than competitors became an advantage. They were winning more contracts that way. And the third piece is really just that frequent communication, right? Regularly communicating progress to your stakeholders, establishing a cadence. This ed tech company, this team we were working with, started providing these regular updates to their executives, to their legal compliance team, to their product owners and other stakeholders, using that concise, plain language about the program's progress, right? That regular communication is helping them build momentum and keeping accessibility on the minds of their leaders, especially as their leaders are going through this budget and planning season, as many of us are. So bottom line, we want to automate reporting for credibility. We want to tie our results to that business impact, and we want to use good communication to keep stakeholders informed. And that's how we want to turn accessibility from just the checkbox into something that we can driver of growth and trust.
So we've talked a lot about tactical challenges, but let's zoom out for a moment to a bigger problem at play. Overall, momentum for proactive accessibility has hit a plateau. 28% of respondents say they start addressing digital accessibility in the planning phase, which is within 1% of what we saw last year. This year, 27% say they start addressing digital accessibility in design. Now, that's noticeably lower than the 32% last year. 5% fewer organizations are addressing accessibility in design. Conversations about accessibility are clearly happening early in the software development lifecycle, but these aren't making their way into operational behavior. When we ask organizations where they adopt accessibility, planning, design, development, quality assurance, or maybe even after the experience goes live, we see an even split among planning, design, and development this year and last year. This year, though, more organizations have shifted from focusing on accessibility in the design stage to the QA stage. So we're seeing a shift to the right in the development lifecycle when we really want to be seeing organizations shift to the left. So many organizations are still treating accessibility as an after-the-fact fix, not an integrated part of their process and culture. And even when teams say they're addressing accessibility early, tool usage is telling a different story. Of those who say they start addressing accessibility in planning or design, only half say they use accessibility-focused design tools. So this gap between intent and implementation suggests that accessibility is still treated as a conversation and not a habit. And the AI tools that designers, content authors, and developers are using don't understand accessibility. When it comes to that execution, solution isn't the accessibility heroine. The solution is the repeatable win. So Jackie, to me, this is where we accessibility professionals could lean on our colleagues in the digital transformation business. This is all about enterprise-wide change management. Don't you think?
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I'll just state the obvious. Anybody who's been doing this work for a while, org change is hard. It's hard. We've seen this consistently in the data over the years, right? It's not easy, and it takes a lot of effort, a lot of coordination. It can be tricky, especially when you have teams that are feeling strapped for time. So we really need our solutions to make this org change easier, right? I don't ever recommend just going to teams with just another automated tool or here's a pile of work, unless it's going to make their life easier for them in the long term. The solutions we have to come to our teams with, they need to be smarter. They need to save time. They need to make their work easier, more efficient. And I like to think, the best approach has to be both smart tools and people with accessibility knowledge and expertise to implement these solutions well. We like to think of that as it's a hybrid intelligence approach. Andrew, can you explain a little bit more about this hybrid intelligence approach?
Thank you, Jackie and Core, for that. So what do we mean, by hybrid intelligence? And it's really about, making accessibility work in the real world, right? Proactive, continuous, and practical. Right? And that takes three things, really working together. And so first, you do need a digital accessibility platform, right? And so, you know, think of it as your, single source of truth, where all of your assets, your issues, actions that you take, or evidence really live, right? No more chasing, kind of like scattered tooling. And so you really do sort of need that centralized system of record. And to us, that really speaks to, really specifically data, right? The second are AI agents, right? And so many of you are probably somewhat familiar with agentic AI, and these aren't, sort of like magic robots. They're actually, focused, auditable helpers that work in your flow. Agents can triage issues, they can summarize changes, they can suggest fixes, draft executive summaries, even help you fix some of your code so that your team spends a lot less time on repetitive tasks and more time on what matters. But it isn't just about, technology. It's not just about data and agents and AI. The third element is human experts. And so, because judgment, coaching, that deep expertise and defensibility, that still really matters, right? AI can, spot a pattern, perform a task, but only a human, an individual can decide if it's actually helpful. Now, the technology is not perfect. And so that partnership, the balance between, platform and data, agents and experts is really the point because when they intersect, that's hybrid intelligence. And that's really the way, especially with AI coming into the picture, can really help reignite momentum and help our customers and yourselves really accelerate progress. Let's wrap with some key takeaways from the study. And thank you, Jackie Core, for all that amazing material, the data from actual SODAR, right? How it actually applied in real world customer scenarios, really proving the fact that those are specific data points that are needed as well, right? That's actually real evidence. So key takeaways, as we look ahead to 2026, these three priorities will define our success, and our being the community here that's joined us today to learn more about this information. And so first, we need absolute, clarity on the true risk status, right? No more processing, pre-processing data, trying to figure out mounds of data, true risk status ownership. That is the first priority. The second one is making accessibility proactive, right? Get out of that reactive break fix cycle and make it practical by embedding it directly into the workflows of your makers, your designers, your developers, your authors, so that it becomes a part of the work, right? Not and no longer an afterthought. It is unsustainable to continue to do it in this really reactive way. And finally, reporting. How do we report ROI? How do we understand the progress that we're making? Is turning our attention more to report on impact in a way that secures and sustains support from our executive leadership, but also meaningfully, what is the actual impact to end users? Because leadership alignment is what turns good intentions into real meaningful outcomes. And if we focus on these, not only is it about risk reduction, and certainly that's one area, but it's also about driving meaningful and true measurable progress in achieving this mission of a more digitally accessible world, access really for everyone. All right, so we're sort of coming to a close. Jackie, do you want to talk a little bit about our SODAR report? Right, get it.
Yes. Thanks, Andrew. So we have up on the screen here a QR code where you can get access to the full report. We've covered the biggest insights today, right? But there's more interesting data in SODAR that you should take a look at that could certainly help your own efforts. I remember when SODAR would come out, I used to pull nuggets from the report each year. That would help me make the business case to my leaders, right? Using some of those nuggets of data to validate what I had been trying to say. Sometimes you just need a different messenger. I would call it maybe positive peer pressure with over 1,600 other professionals who have been on this accessibility journey, right, for some time. They're saying the same things that I was trying to say. that accessibility is a sound investment and that orgs are starting to see it as this business advantage. In addition, we also have a downloadable executive summary, right? So if you need something lighter, quicker, something you want to share with other stakeholders, you can certainly use that as a conversation starter. Corb, I think we have some time for some Q&A.
So the first one is about AI being everywhere. And just looking for some clarification, because we, on the one hand, say 82% say teams are using AI tools, but only 28% are using design tools and 31% are on the developer tools. So how do you get to 82%? And so just real briefly, I'd say that the 28 and the 31% for design and for development tools, respectively, those are AI powered or non-AI powered. The 82% is reflecting an AI adoption generally across the organization, not just design and developer tools. So what we're observing is that even though organizations are adopting AI, the adoption of tools that support proactive in-flow accessibility appears limited. Teams are leveraging AI in the business, but they're stuck in a reactive approach when it comes to accessibility. So Jackie, the second question is for you. You mentioned closing the evidence gap by showing how accessibility can help win contracts. And the question is, how did you help your example client do this? Was it a checklist or something more detailed about proving those contract wins tied to accessibility?
Yeah, great question. I love it. So there's the different ways that I've seen organizations do this. This one in particular, as part of winning those contracts, they put together a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template, or an ACR, accessibility conformance report, right, which is sort of a standard documentation, sort of outlining the current state of the accessibility of their product, right? And so that was an important piece of evidence for them. And our teams helped them put together that VPAT. We also put together sort of this separate narrative, almost this story, almost a one-pager sort of accessibility storytelling that talked about for their potential buyers their commitment to accessibility, the work that they're doing, right? That they want to be partners in this. And so as they continued to remediate and make progress, right, their buyers were coming to them saying, we need to know how accessible you are, and we need to know you're going to be good partners for us because, right, we have our own compliance requirements. And so it was sort of this combination of, right, this VPAT and this storytelling, this sort of evidence that they're good partners. And we started tracking that, right? We started seeing what contracts we were winning where accessibility was brought up as a requirement. And this accessibility team was able to tie that, right, to winning more contracts where we could demonstrate, that accessibility was a factor in that.
Yeah, we got a question too about another one about making that business case for digital accessibility. Have you found the deadlines for accessibility compliance are helpful? For example, the April 2026 or 2027 deadlines that are coming up for government authorities in the US. And, I think that one of the things that I've observed, and Jackie, I want to get your perspective and Andrew, yours as well here, is that these deadlines are taking something that we've been saying as accessibility champions for years, right? The best standard we can find out there is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And, we could debate whether it's 2.1, 2.2, right? But point being, that's the standard that's out there. And now we have these really black and white, what is and what isn't covered. And so what's really helpful about these deadlines is actually the exceptions. They take a lot of the ambiguity out for the standpoint of, well, what does it mean if a document is archived? If it's archival material, does that mean that it's not on the website anymore? Does it mean that it's content that's not referenced anymore? Is it just because I posted it on March of 2026, it's okay? And really took that and made it really clear in the guidance to say, in this example, right, that if I have a document that is truly an archive, it's not really being used by most people today, it's the meeting minutes from our 2002 village board meeting, right? That's definitely archived. But if it's a form that we published a long time ago that people are still expected to complete, or it's reference material that explains something that's happening today, and we reference people back to that old guidance, that isn't an archive anymore. That's something that people need today to do to accomplish a task. that very much is needing to be accessible. So I think the deadlines are one piece of this, but really the clarity comes from a lot of those exceptions. Jackie, Andrew, what would you add to this idea of are deadlines helpful?
I would say, from a purely from an accessibility perspective, the deadline, definitely raises the general awareness of accessibility, and it creates the conditions for asking questions about, what does this mean? Similar to some of the things that you said there, Corb. But the other part is that it's increasing the overall maturity, I would say, of the market, of the industry, especially if you are a technology organization that might be selling to government or selling to higher ed. You're certainly going to start to see that actually play out. And so, yes, I would say that it can be helpful in terms of building that business case. And that comes from just general market knowledge and maturity of customers that are now in a position to more understand exactly what it means to actually not only make something accessible, but in particular, understand the way in which you sustain the practice.
Yeah, great. Both great responses already. I'll just add one last little thing is it's exactly what drove change for this ed tech company, right? If all of their potential buyers are asking about ADA Title II compliance and whether you are not, right? That's exactly what raised accessibility within their organization to take action on it.
Great. Thank you both. Andrew, this one for you. This person says, I'm getting pressure from leadership to leverage AI tools to improve accessibility and drive down costs. How is Level Access leveraging AI to improve your tools portfolio?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and yes, definitely can empathize with the statement as well. Um, yeah, so I'd sort of maybe look at this in two ways. The first one is how are we actually leveraging AI, embedding it into our tooling, and making it available to our customers. And so as we look across our entire portfolio of products in our ecosystem, we have testing tools, we have developer tooling, and so we have reporting. And so we're thinking of ways to incorporate and embed AI into that tooling. Certainly, we want to be as well responsible for how we do it. So there are abilities for customers to opt in and out. We have a data practice that tries to ensure that we are practicing AI in an ethical fashion. And then we are also tightly coupled with our privacy and security teams to make sure that we are doing it in a secure way. So not just, calling the open APIs as an example, right? The other way to think about it as well, and what we're also looking at is how do we actually, as more, I guess, as organizations start to use AI a lot more, those organizations, many of them, for example, organizations that might be leveraging coding assistants as an example. So whether that be Cloud Code, OpenAI Codex, and so on. And so we're also considering different ways on how we ourselves integrate into that ecosystem, because as we sort of talked about throughout this webinar, it is about how do we embed, AI and accessibility into workflows so that you don't have to leave those workflows. So more recently, we've launched our first MCP server. We're going to be extending MCP, Model Context Protocol, which is effectively a protocol that allows AI to talk to each other. And making it a lot simpler to integrate into those ecosystems. So those are kind of like the two ways that we are currently approaching it.
And Jackie, going to you at this one, at least to start,
Mm-hmm.
and leveraging your high ed background, what
Mm-hmm.
is the best way, in your opinion, to tackle keeping technology accessible within a higher education institution across all of our technology, including mobile apps, when there are so many and most of the technology is built by third-party companies?
Higher ed, there's a lot of layers in higher ed, right, around digital assets and content. It's not just a website, it's not just an app. There's courses, there's what's in the courses, there's platforms, right? Procurement is a big one. One of the pieces that I see in orgs that are doing this well in higher ed are they have really sound procurement processes. They have accessibility as a requirement. throughout procurement, right? When they're first sending out an RFP, when they're sort of searching for vendors, they're asking about accessibility up front. They're using accessibility in sort of their selection. They're including accessibility in contracts. They're finding those good accessibility partners who are going to work with them. I think procurement is a huge area that has that with some sound process we can tackle that. I think it is also a lot of finding your SMEs or your allies in the different areas, right? Everywhere from instructional designers and trying to sort of build out training and knowledge within these little areas, sort of distribute your accessibility knowledge and checks within it and really working together to do that, right? In from platform to documents to procurement, really working together to try to build out that program. It's tricky when there's a lot of content in all these different areas.
Well, I think we will call it there for today. There's some other great questions here, and what I'll tell you is that we'll do our best to follow up with you folks with those questions via email. And certainly, this is a moment too for you to connect with us. So up on the screen very shortly, we will show you our LinkedIn profiles and the QR codes. There they are. There's a QR code, 3 of them on screen, one for each of us. Would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. Send us your questions and keep this conversation going. We're really grateful that all of you were able to join us for the review of our 7th annual digital state of digital accessibility webinar. We look forward to connecting with you. We'll be sending you a copy of this recording and a link to the findings if you didn't already scan it from when it was on screen. So we're really looking forward to speaking with you again soon about how we can help you find accessibility issues earlier, to fix those faster, and then prove progress in your digital accessibility programs. Thanks so much for making the time to join us today on behalf of Jackie, Andrew, and the team at Level. We hope you have a great afternoon.